Alexander Cole was the kind of man who made headlines without ever seeking them. He didn't need to. The empire he had built, with blood, calculation, and ruthless precision, spoke louder than any interview could. To his competitors, he was a predator circling the weak. To his shareholders, he was a genius who turned money into more money. Yet when he stood alone at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring at the city below, silence pressing harder than applause ever could, the millions in his accounts could not fill the hollowness in his chest. He had everything: mansions, cars, an army of employees who jumped at his command. But there was one voice he could not command, one presence missing from his life: his daughter, Emily. He told himself she was ungrateful, too sensitive, too naive to understand the sacrifices he'd made. But deep down, a truth gnawed at him. He had not been a father, only a provider. And then came the day that would unmake him. In front of strangers, at an event where pride should have been his armor, his daughter looked at him with eyes colder than his own reflection and said, "He's not my father. He's a stranger." The word cut deeper than any betrayal. Alexander Cole had not been born ruthless. Poverty had raised him that way. He grew up in a one-bedroom flat that smelled of damp walls and despair. His father was a factory worker who drank away half his wages. His mother scrubbed floors in houses that would never be hers. Alexander, thin and sharp-eyed even as a boy, decided early that life wasn't about fairness. It was about taking before someone else did. His first taste of power came when he was 15. He bought candy from the local store on credit, then resold it at a markup to the neighborhood children. When the storekeeper demanded repayment, Alexander lied, deflected, and eventually walked away without paying a cent. He wasn't ashamed. He was proud. By his 20s, that same pride had sharpened into ambition. He studied business not to learn but to outwit. He treated partners like stepping stones, friends like tools, and opportunities like prey. If someone stood in his way, he found their weakness and pressed until they broke. People called him shrewd, but what they meant was merciless. He bought out smaller companies and gutted them for profit. He slashed jobs without hesitation, telling himself it was efficiency. He signed contracts that left rivals bankrupt and allies indebted. Each victory fed the belief that compassion was a liability. Love, friendship, family, those were chains that slowed men down. Power came from severing them. By 35, Alexander had everything he had once dreamed of: wealth, status, and a city that whispered his name with a mix of admiration and fear. He dined in glittering halls, shook hands with politicians, and commanded rooms with his presence. But in the quiet of his nights, when champagne flutes were empty and applause faded, the silence returned. The only sound was the echo of choices made and bridges burned. Alexander didn't care, or at least he told himself he didn't. Success was all that mattered. The world respected him, and respect was the only love he needed. What he did not realize then was that the price of his empire had already been paid, not in dollars, but in the absence of a daughter who barely knew him. Emily Cole grew up in a mansion where marble floors gleamed but warmth was absent. To the outside world, she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country, surrounded by toys, designer clothes, and private tutors. To Emily, however, all the gold in the house felt like bars of a cage. Her earliest memories of her father were not of laughter or bedtime stories, but the back of his tailored suit as he rushed out the door. Birthdays came and went with gifts more expensive than her friends had dreamed of: diamond pendants, miniature ponies, even a piano she never asked for. What never came was his presence. At school recitals, she would scan the crowd, hoping to see his face among the parents. He never came. At award ceremonies, it was always a driver or a nanny clapping politely, while Emily's eyes lingered on the empty seat beside them. She began to draw family pictures at school. Her mother long gone, her nanny included, and herself. Her father was never in them. "Why didn't you draw your daddy?" the teacher once asked. Emily had shrugged. "Because he's never there." Alexander told himself she was too young to notice, too young to understand that everything he was building was for her. But children notice what is absent more than what is present. And what was absent more than anything was him. By the time Emily turned 12, she had stopped asking when he would be home. She had stopped waiting by the window for headlights that never appeared. Instead, she began to build a quiet wall around her heart, the same kind of wall her father had spent his life perfecting. Emily was 16 the night she finally let her anger spill. Alexander had returned home late, as usual, after a day of meetings and negotiations. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and barely noticed his daughter standing in the doorway of his study. "Do you even know what today is?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked up, irritated at the interruption. "Wednesday," he muttered, glancing back at the stack of papers on his desk. "It's my birthday," she snapped. 16 years old. And you weren't there. Again. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Alexander felt a twinge of something. Guilt, perhaps, but he quickly buried it. "Emily, I provided you with everything you could ever want. You have no idea how hard I work for you." "I don't want your money," she shot back. "I wanted you at my recital. I wanted you at dinner tonight. I wanted a father, not a bank account." Her voice cracked, and with it came the rawness of years of silent disappointment. But Alexander only sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're being dramatic. When you're older, you'll understand. Sacrifices have to be made for success." Emily's eyes filled with tears, not weakness, but of realization. She saw then that her father's empire had no room for her. "Maybe I don't want your kind of success," she whispered, "because if this is what it takes, I'd rather have nothing." She turned and stormed out, leaving him staring into his glass. For the first time, Alexander felt a faint sting of loss, but he dismissed it quickly. He told himself she would grow out of it. He didn't know it was only the beginning of her turning away. By the time Alexander turned 45, his empire towered over the city like a monument to ambition. His name appeared in magazines, his face on the covers of business journals. He owned properties across continents, flew in private jets, and dined with ministers and kings. To the world, he had reached the summit of success. But at that summit, the air was thin. He sat at long mahogany tables surrounded by advisors and executives, yet none dared speak to him beyond business. Laughter at his parties was loud, but it never touched him. Even at home, the silence in his vast mansion was unbearable, broken only by the echo of his footsteps across marble. Emily, now a young woman, rarely called. When she did, their conversations were short, mechanical. "How are your studies?" "Good." "Do you need money?" "No." "All right then." The calls ended faster than they began. On nights when the city sparkled beneath him, Alexander would pour another glass of whiskey and stare out the window. He had conquered everything he set out to conquer, yet the victories tasted like ash. What was the use of being admired by millions when the one person who mattered most felt nothing for him at all? Still, he brushed away the thought as weakness. He convinced himself that one day Emily would see the empire he had built and finally understand. But the truth was harsher. The higher he climbed, the further he drifted from her reach. Emily Cole had grown into a woman with fire in her eyes and a heart that burned for causes her father could never understand. While Alexander built towers of glass and steel, Emily walked streets filled with hunger, poverty, and need. She studied social work, volunteered at shelters, and spent weekends in communities her father's companies had quietly exploited. When Alexander heard of her pursuits, he scoffed. "You're wasting your life," he told her one evening over dinner. He had arranged a meeting, hoping to persuade her into the corporate world. The restaurant glimmered with chandeliers and crystal glasses, but Emily sat stiff, refusing to be dazzled. "It's not a waste," she said firmly. "Helping people gives me purpose. It makes me feel alive." Alexander leaned back, unimpressed. Purpose? You could be running companies, influencing governments, shaping economies. Instead, you hand out bread to beggars. That isn't purpose. It's charity for the weak. Her jaw tightened. The weak, as you call them, are people. People your empire has crushed. Families left jobless when you shut down factories. Children who sleep hungry because you cut costs to save profits. You don't build, father. You destroy. The word father fell heavy on her tongue, almost sarcastic. Alexander's face hardened. "I built everything I have from nothing. Sacrifices must be made. That's the way the world works." "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head. That's the way you work. I don't want your empire. I don't want to be like you. Her words struck him, but he masked the wound with anger. You're naive. The world will eat you alive. Emily stood, her chair scraping against marble. Then I'd rather be eaten than become you. She left the table without looking back, leaving Alexander to sip his wine in silence. For the first time, he felt something stronger than irritation. Fear. Fear that his daughter wasn't just drifting away. She was running, faster than he could ever catch. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, a stage set for wealth and influence. Alexander Cole stood among senators, CEOs, and dignitaries, the very people who whispered his name with both reverence and fear. Tonight, his daughter was a guest speaker, honored for her humanitarian work overseas. He watched her from his table, a poised young woman in a simple dress, no diamonds, no designer flair, yet commanding more admiration than all the glittering gowns in the room. Pride flickered in him, though he would never admit it. Then came the moment. "Before I begin," Emily said, her voice steady, "I want to acknowledge someone in the audience, a man of immense influence, known for his power, his wealth, and his success." She paused, her eyes meeting Alexander's across the hall. "He is here tonight, but to me, he is not my father. He is a stranger." The words hit like a blade. The room froze. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Alexander, usually unshakable, felt his chest tighten as though the air had been stolen from him. His hand gripped his glass too hard, and for a second he thought it might shatter. Emily continued her speech, turning her gaze away as if he were invisible. Applause followed her words, but Alexander heard none of it. All he heard was that single word, stranger, echoing in his mind like a curse. He had been called ruthless, arrogant, heartless. He had worn those labels like armor. But stranger? Stranger meant distance. Stranger meant irrelevance. Stranger meant he had lost her completely. When the evening ended, Alexander did not stay to shake hands or bask in prestige. He slipped out into the cold night, his driver trailing nervously behind. For the first time in his life, Alexander Cole did not feel powerful. He felt hollow. As the city lights blurred outside the car window, her words replayed again and again. Each repetition cut deeper, until even a man who had once believed himself invincible could no longer ignore the truth. He was not her father, not in the ways that mattered. He was, indeed, a stranger. That night, Alexander lay awake in his penthouse, the city glittering beneath him like a kingdom he no longer recognized. The word stranger pulsed through his head, refusing to fade. It was not just an insult. It was a verdict. He tried to drown it with whiskey, but the memories it stirred were stronger than the burn in his throat. He saw Emily at 5 years old, standing on a school stage in a tiny tutu, scanning the crowd with hopeful eyes. He hadn't been there. He had been in Tokyo, closing a merger. He saw her at 12, holding up a trophy from a debate competition. He remembered the phone call he had cut short, too busy to hear her excitement. He saw her at 16, shouting that she wanted a father, not a bank account. He had laughed it off then, telling himself she was being dramatic. Now, the echo of her voice rang truer than ever. For the first time, Alexander questioned the meaning of his victories. What was the worth of skyscrapers, contracts, and wealth when the one person he had built them for wanted nothing to do with him? The silence of his penthouse felt unbearable. The marble floors, the priceless art, the glittering chandeliers, all mocked him. He had built a palace, but it was empty, and in that emptiness, the truth settled heavy on his chest. He had conquered the world, but lost his daughter. The morning after Emily's speech, Alexander did something he had never done before. He cleared his schedule. No meetings, no calls, no deals. Instead, he sat at his desk and wrote his daughter a letter by hand, the pen feeling awkward in fingers more accustomed to signing contracts and apologies. He sent flowers with the letter, then gifts, jewelry, books she once loved as a child, even a donation made in her name to one of her charities. Days passed. No response. Finally, he called her. "Emily," he said softly when she answered. "I'd like to see you, just to talk." There was a long pause. Talk. Her voice was guarded, unfamiliar. "You've had 25 years to talk, and you never did." "Please," he tried again. "I know I've made mistakes. Let me make it right." Another pause, then a quiet sigh. "You can't buy your way into being a father, Alexander. That's all you've ever tried to do. Gifts, money, donations, they mean nothing to me." The line clicked dead. Alexander sat in silence, the phone heavy in his hand. For the first time, he realized the enormity of what he was facing. He could negotiate billion-dollar mergers, bend governments, and outwit rivals, but he could not negotiate love. Money had been his weapon, his shield, his answer to everything. But in this battle, it was useless. His daughter did not want his empire. She wanted him. And that was the one thing he had never learned how to give. For days, Alexander wrestled with the silence that followed Emily's rejection. The old him would have buried the pain beneath work, drowning it in contracts and numbers. But this time he couldn't. Every deal felt meaningless, every figure hollow. So he did something no one expected. He stepped back. For the first time in decades, Alexander Cole withdrew from the empire he had built. His board panicked. Rivals celebrated. But Alexander barely noticed. His war was no longer in the boardroom. It was inside himself. He began small. He visited one of the community shelters where Emily had worked. At first, he stood awkwardly in his tailored suit, out of place among peeling paint and weary faces. But then, a little boy tugged his sleeve and asked if he could help carry boxes of food. Alexander, unaccustomed to manual work, bent down and did it. The boy smiled at him, and the smile lingered in Alexander's mind long after. He returned the next day, and the next. Soon, he shed the suit for simple clothes, learning to serve meals, sweep floors, and really listen, to stories of people he had once considered invisible. For the first time, he felt something stir in him that no deal had ever given. Connection. It was clumsy, imperfect, and slow, but Alexander Cole, the ruthless millionaire, was changing, not because he wanted redemption in the eyes of the world, but because he wanted, desperately, to stop being a stranger to his daughter. When Emily first heard that her father had stepped away from his empire, she didn't believe it. Rumors of Alexander Cole's downfall had circulated before, always exaggerated. But when she received word from colleagues that he had been spotted serving meals at the shelter, she was stunned. The first time she saw him there, she froze. He was standing at the back, wearing plain clothes, clumsily ladling soup into bowls. His posture was stiff, his movements awkward, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, looked different, softer, unsure, human. He noticed her and paused. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander gave a small nod, almost a bow, and returned to his task without a word. Emily's guard remained high. Days turned into weeks, and she watched from a distance. He didn't chase her, didn't send gifts anymore. Instead, he kept showing up quietly, consistently, sweeping floors, carrying boxes, listening to people he once would have dismissed. Slowly, her anger began to crack. She saw a man who was trying, not with money, but with presence. A man who, for once, wasn't demanding respect, but earning it. One evening, after the shelter closed, she approached him. "You're not very good at sweeping," she said, her tone sharp but her eyes softer than before. Alexander chuckled, a sound rare even to his own ears. "I'm learning." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was something, an opening. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a flicker of hope. It was late, the shelter long since emptied, when Emily found her father sitting alone on a worn bench. His shoulders, once square with authority, now sagged under the weight of humility. She stood before him, arms folded. "Why are you doing this, Alexander? You don't need to prove anything to me." He looked up at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw no armor in his eyes, just a man stripped bare. "I know I can't undo the years I stole from you," he said quietly. "I can't erase the birthdays I missed, the moments I abandoned. I can't change that I was a stranger in your life. But I don't want to die that way." Her breath caught. "I was a stranger even to myself," he went on. "I thought money was enough. Power, respect. But I see now I was blind. All I want now is to know my daughter before it's too late. Silence stretched between them, heavy with years of pain. Emily's walls trembled. She had dreamed of hearing those words. Yet part of her still resisted. Could he truly change? But the tears in his eyes weren't the tears of a manipulator. They were raw, unpolished, real. Emily slowly sat beside him. "Then stop being a stranger," she whispered. For the first time in decades, Alexander allowed himself to weep. Not as a millionaire, not as a tycoon, but as a father. And for the first time, Emily let him. Months passed, and Alexander Cole was no longer the man whose name echoed in boardrooms. The newspapers wrote of his mysterious retreat. Analysts speculated on the fall of his empire, but Alexander barely glanced at the headlines. His days were quieter now. He still visited the shelter, not out of guilt, but out of choice. He found meaning in the small things, sharing meals, listening to stories, laughing with people who expected nothing from him but his presence. Most important of all, he began spending real time with Emily. At first, their moments were tentative, short walks, awkward conversations, silences that felt too long. But gradually, they learned each other's rhythms. He listened more than he spoke, and Emily, cautious but willing, began to let him in. One afternoon, they sat in a park, sunlight spilling through the trees. Emily laughed at something clumsy, he said, and the sound felt like a gift he had been chasing all his life. For the first time, Alexander felt rich, not because of what he owned, but because of who sat beside him. He had been ruthless, powerful, untouchable. But none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that he was no longer a stranger. Emily looked at him, her eyes softer now. "You're not the man you used to be," she said. Alexander smiled faintly. "No, I finally became what I should have been all along. Not a millionaire, not a tycoon, a father,